Hello and welcome to Memory Lane. I'm your host, Sam. This is the second episode for this podcast, and today we have Catherine to discuss her interest in genealogy as well as sharing her family story. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So how did you get started in genealogy?
Well, initially, I just started because when I was little, I listened to my grandmother tell stories about her family, and it just kind of struck, I don't know, an interest in me to just want to know more about people that I had never met. So that was definitely probably a key factor in how I got started.
Have you encountered any roadblocks when you were researching?
Lots. The biggest thing is sometimes you have to be willing to stop for a little while and then pick it back up, because if you just keep on, the frustration levels just kind of build on each other. So after a while, you just have to take a break. And then usually when you go back, you find that, you found the information that originally you couldn't find, because there's going to be issues with a name being wrong in a census, or a death certificate that doesn't have a mother and a father listed, or some key piece of information that you were really hoping to find that all of a sudden you got to figure out what to do because you don't have it. So things like that are definitely roadblocks in moving along quickly. It's not a quick process. You have to be willing to take the time and really dig.
Do you have a specific website you use to conduct genealogical research?
I do have some that I lean towards. Everybody uses Ancestry, and I use them a great deal, but there's also FamilySearch.org that is a really good site that's free of charge. For someone that really wants to get into it that can't devote a whole lot of money to it, I like to spend a lot of time on Find a Grave. Newspapers.com is great if you're looking for, articles that might pop up on a family member, or obituaries that otherwise you might not have access to. So there's a lot of great sites that definitely help.
Now, newspapers.com, you have to pay, right?
Yes,
for that website.
There is a fee for that, but I will say it's probably well worth it, because there's just a wealth of information that you can find out things about your family that you never knew you would find, or sometimes never want to find, but it's definitely interesting.
Have you tried DNA testing?
I have. I did the DNA test through Ancestry. I'm still trying to figure out all the ins and outs of that, because it does give you some directions to go as far as, where your DNA, what countries your DNA came from. But it's not always that easy figuring out exactly who it was that came from those countries, which is something I've run into. So it definitely makes it difficult.
Did the results surprise you?
Yes and no. There was certain things that I know would show up, British ancestry, Irish, Scottish, that kind of thing. But then it popped up that I was 1% Basque, and I was like, I don't even know what that is, much less know where it came from. And I'm still yet to figure out where it came from. So that is going to be one of my great mysteries, I'm afraid.
Has the DNA test helped your research?
In some ways it's helped, because at least through Ancestry, it will give you matches if you're willing to, or if the people that are listed as matches are willing to reach out to you, and you can reach out to them, and then you can kind of share information, which is something that my family has done. Reaching out to other people and sharing informations that way. And then sometimes you can come up with some stuff that you didn't know was there that you needed to look for. So eventually I think I would like to try something like maybe the 23andMe or something like that, because I'm also interested in medical conditions that run in my family, because I do have a child with the genetic issue, and part of me kind of wonders if that could have come from somewhere in my family, and that would just be an interesting avenue to see what might show up.
Have you discovered anything interesting throughout your research?
Yes, and a lot of them kind of shocked me because I wasn't prepared for them, especially kind of on my dad's side of the family. And there were some horrible tragedies on my dad's side of the family. Not going into a whole lot of detail, because some of them were kind of gruesome, but we had some that died very young, tragically. Unfortunately, I didn't get to know my dad's side as well as I could have, because of being raised with my grandmother, who was my mother's mother, I definitely know more geared towards that side, but that's kind of made me more interested even in my dad's family, because I don't have an avenue to really talk to a whole lot of people or know who to talk to figure out information about his side. So in a way, when you don't have anything to go on, it kind of makes you want to dig that much more just to try and piece things together. Because, there's always stories. There was a family Bible that I've researched and found that said that, our first ancestor came over from Ireland, kind of kidnapped, indentured servitude, that kind of thing. I haven't found anything to prove it yet, but it's interesting to think about. And who knows, maybe one day I will. But just finding things like that sparks interest, because you're like, hey, that's kind of neat. That's kind of cool. And so it definitely makes you want to research that much more if you can find an interesting story. If for nothing else, to prove if it's fact or fiction, which is
right.
Interesting in and of itself, because you just never know until you find something concrete on your own. You can have people give you information all day, or at least this is how I am, until I have some records that actually prove it. I hesitate to say something is fact unless it's somebody that I know that's close that actually dealt with the person they're talking about. But it definitely inspires you, I think, to dig that much more when you don't have a whole lot of information. And it makes it more interesting when you do find that information, because you feel like, hey, I may have figured that out. I've been trying to figure this out for so long, but I may have the answer. So that part I enjoy. I like uncovering the little mysteries that I didn't know, just so I can dig more into them.
The ancestor you mentioned that was kidnapped and sent to the New World, what information have you found on him so far?
His name was Richard Murphy. The story is that he ended up, after he was released as an indentured servant, that he actually married William Byrd's daughter, which would be really neat if that was the case. I have nothing at all that proves it except for, a family story that was handed down in a family Bible that's located in archives in Georgia, or at least at one time it was. But as far as finding, a marital record or anything like that, I have never found anything like that yet. But who knows? Maybe one day if I keep digging. So it's interesting to think about anyway.
Yeah, it is.
The only thing I have managed to find that I know concrete, because I've looked through wills and things like that, that the Bible, this was the family Bible, mentions, is I've been able to go back and definitively look at those people and look at their wills where they at least talk about who their wife was and who their children was. And in that instance, you're like, yes, okay, I've got this information. I know this is right. So there's certain parts that I know that are concrete, which is great. Like I had an ancestor, I'm wanting to say his name was Simon, and supposedly he was killed by a Tory during the Revolutionary War period. His body was thrown basically into a swamp area because his plantation actually was on a swamp. I haven't seen definitive records that show exactly where he was serving, but his wife actually received some money from the government. A pension. Or, I don't know if you want to call it a pension, but basically she was supplying the army with goods or whatever.
Probably information.
And who knows? It's interesting to think about. But anyway, whatever she was supplying them with, she was receiving payment for that. Even if he wasn't involved, she was. Mm-hmm. And, she didn't necessarily fight, but she fought in a different way. She was still part of the cause, just a different...
In the background.
But it's interesting to think that if he wasn't, fighting, and he was killed as someone that was aiding the cause, and it really wasn't him, it was her. And the irony of that, more than likely he probably did. I know at that time most of the men were participating, in the fight at that time. So more than likely he probably did. I just haven't found anything concrete other than the fact that she did receive some payments, yes. So, which is interesting.
I remembered a while back you talked about an ancestor that started, I believe it was a German Reformed church. What's the story behind that?
There's actually on my grandmother's side of the family, further down, that married into the Faust line. They were called the Claps. And they actually formed a German Reformed church,
Okay.
which is pretty neat. And as far as I know, the church still stands. I think it's called the Brick Church now. Yeah, there's a story, and it was two brothers basically that started the church. And if I remember correctly, one of the brothers' wife kind of had a vision of a church in in this area or whatever, and so there came the church. And like I said, it still stands today. So
You plan to visit that church?
it is my hope to one day visit all the places that I know my ancestors lived at some point. I would really, really, really like to do that. My first stop though is going to probably be Kentucky, because even though the coal mining camp that my grandmother was born in does no longer exist, I'd still like to go visit the area. I'd like to go try and visit the cemetery where her mother is buried, even though she doesn't have a tombstone, unfortunately. I would still like to go there, and just having heard so much about her and everything, I would still just like to go and just stand there, just say I've been there.
I'm glad you mentioned a family Bible earlier, because before vital records came along, the family Bible was probably the only kind of record to prove your existence.
In fact, my grandmother, that was how she got her Social Security card, as she had the family Bible, and she took that to prove basically who she was. Unfortunately, there was a house fire and it was destroyed, which breaks my heart, because that would have been amazing to have. But especially back then, in a place like a coal mining camp, where a lot of times people were born by midwives, a lot of people weren't even born in hospitals. You didn't have birth certificates. It's just you were born and they wrote your name and your birth date and everything in the family Bible, and that's all you had. So a family Bible is priceless. In fact, I wish it was something that we kind of still did, even now, just because it's just interesting to have that to pass on. It's a great gift to give somebody, is your family history. Hopefully one day I'll pass what I've done on to, my children. Hopefully they will, want to continue on that. But family history is not, it's good to do for yourself, but you're also doing it because you're wanting to pass it on. Because family history doesn't do any good if you don't share it.
And it kind of reflects, the person that you are now, somewhat.
Absolutely. It kind of shows how you were shaped, because who you were raised. They raised you because of the way they were raised, and they raised them because of the way they were raised, and so it just kind of continues on and on and on. So in that respect, it really does shape you, because from one generation to the next, their ideals and their values were passed to the next generation. And you would hope that it would be the good. Not always the case, but we all like to hope that it's the good that's passed from one generation to the next. And that's how it's done, is through stories. Them sitting down and talking to their children or their grandchildren about their childhood or their parents' childhood, and so on and so forth, back through the years.
What advice would you give for someone who is starting out their own genealogical research?
I say start with someone that you know a lot of information about, that you're positive you've got the information. Like, I started with my grandmother because I knew her. I lived with her. I know her history, what she told me. I knew definitively who her parents were when she was born. Dates and places that you have to have in order to get started. If you have that, then you have a starting point and you can go from there. But you have to have somebody to begin with that you at least have some information about, that you know something about siblings or aunts or uncles, just to make sure that you have the right person. Because most of the time, unless they have a very unique name, you'll have a bunch of people with the exact same name that lived during the exact same time. And unless those details, there's no way of knowing if you're researching the right person. And there's nothing more frustrating, because I've had this happen, in doing a whole bunch of research on a person and then getting to the end of it and finding out that it didn't even go with who the line that you were trying to work on, and that you were barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, the whole time. It is so frustrating. Because it's just awful seeing all this work and be like, okay, there's the trash can, because it's not going to do you any good. But yeah, that's definitely frustrating. But I would say definitely start with what you know. Also, you can't get discouraged. You have to be willing to put in the time. If you are going to sit down and do family research, and you think that you're going to sit down and say, oh, I'm going to take this weekend and I'm going to get my family research all knocked out this weekend, it is not going to happen.
It is a slow process.
It's I've been
Tedious.
working on mine for years now.
Yeah.
And I'm still, dare say, I'm still at the beginning stages. Mm-hmm. It is almost a lifelong process to do it and do it right if you want to do it right. Mm-hmm. It's not anything you can rush or that you need to rush, because that's when you end up making mistakes. Because it's not going to be something that you do in a few weeks or a few months or even a couple years. It's years to do family research and do it right.
If you could have coffee with any of your ancestors, who would you choose and why?
I would have to choose, even though I know a great deal about her because she raised me, my grandmother, Lenora. Because there's still so much more that I know I never got the chance to hear, that now that I'm older, I know I would appreciate a whole lot more. And definitely, it would definitely be my grandmother.
Does she record anything about her life?
She actually did. After she fell later on, in her later years, she broke her hip and she went to stay with my mother. To recover, and she was able to record some of her stories, which is great. I'm glad that it's there and that we have it. So we at least, because of that, have a little piece of her, that we can always listen to. And I haven't had the pleasure of listening to them myself yet. Hopefully I will. That's something I'll have to prepare myself for when the time comes, because I know for me, I'll probably be a mess, because it'll be hard for me to listen to. Because I know my mom said that while she was telling her story, that she cried a lot. And I know as soon as I hear her cry, I'm probably going to cry. But, it is something that I'm glad that she was able to do.
Can you tell us a little bit about your grandmother?
She was a very strong, determined woman. By far the strongest woman I've ever known. She was born in Crummies Creek, Kentucky at a coal mining camp. Her dad was a miner. Her mother's father was a miner. And that was pretty much the family business back then. Especially her dad's side of the family, just about all of them were miners. Unfortunately, her mom passed when she was about 2 from complications during a pregnancy. And so then it was just her and her dad. And unfortunately, that left them in a state of moving from camp to camp and not really having a permanent home, where they just kind of lived day to day. Finding places to sleep wherever they could, and her dad just trying to work at a camp just enough to be able to actually feed them. And he did the best he could, being someone who all of a sudden, has to raise his daughter because his wife has passed. It was difficult. He had to leave her with strangers during the day just so he could work in the mine, and they slept on the side of the road in the woods at night sometimes, as they traveled from camp to camp. And I like to say things got a whole lot better, but it was always hard. Because even after he remarried, she had children for a previous marriage, and then they had children together. So that's a lot of mouths to feed, and you just don't make much being a miner. Mining was bad anyway, but mining during the Great Depression, definitely added to things being even harder. It was rough for many reasons. It was rough in the fact that pretty much everything you made revolved around the mining camp. If you made any money, you could only use it at the camp, because it wasn't really money. It was more of a notes, or almost looked like a little token if you ever saw a coin. And it was only good for the place that you earned it. You couldn't use it anywhere else. You didn't make much, which meant you had a lot of credit. So pretty much as soon as you made something, you basically owed it right back to the company. The work conditions were, of course, rough. There was a lot of mining accidents. I mean, even now it's still dangerous, but back then it was a really tough job. There was so many people killed or injured, like my great grandfather, and he had family that was actually killed in mining accidents. So it was definitely a hard life. I remember her saying that she heard the sirens, and she knew it was her dad. And so she ran down to the mine and kind of knelt beside the mine and just prayed that God wouldn't take her father, because she had just lost her mom. And she said she knew if her dad came out of the mine that she'd know he'd be okay. They have some kind of device in the mine that they use to haul materials and stuff like that, and they finally rolled him out of the mine, and he had lost fingers. He actually ended up only having 3 fingers on one hand and 2 fingers on the other, but he was okay. And he was only out of work just a few days, and he went right back to work.
Oh my gosh.
So he was a pretty strong man himself. She went through a lot. I know my grandmother talked about her clothes that she'd wear. Her stepmom was kind of a big woman, especially compared to her. And she would take her dresses and cut them off, basically, so she would have something to wear. She would have to wire her soles of her shoes back on the soles on the bottom of her shoe. She would have to take wires and put through in order to hold the soles onto her shoe. She only had a 3rd grade education, because if you move around a lot, you can't go to school. Having said that, she was an extremely smart woman. I mean, she might not have known everything in the world as far as the things you would normally learn in school. I will say this, though, she had the most beautiful penmanship. I mean, considering she only had a 3rd grade education, she wrote beautifully. So it was just a different time. She married when she was 13 years old. I mean, it was a different time. But when we came into the picture and she was raising us, she did the best she could, but she couldn't help us with homework assignments and stuff like that, like, parents normally would, just because she didn't have the education to be able to do that. But she always encouraged us to do, the best that we could. And she did the best she could, raising us with what little bit she had, because she, at that time, was just living on a Social Security income, and, we didn't have a lot, but she made sure that we had the necessities what we needed. And she taught me so much. And she's also, I guess, the reason why I am the way I am, because she was always the type that if something needed done and she couldn't get anybody to do it, she would do it. And I'm very much like that. So I guess I come by it honestly.
It just goes to show how resilient people were back then.
Yes, absolutely. You did what you had to do. You couldn't just lay down and quit, because most of the time you had family. She had 5 children, and then later on, like I said, she raised my sister and I. She had so many grandchildren and great grandchildren, and she even had great great grandchildren when she passed away. Huge family, But she was definitely one of a kind. My hope is that maybe some of her rubbed off on me since she raised me, and I would be proud, if that was the case.
Growing up with your grandmother, did she have special traditions during holidays?
Her biggest thing was Thanksgiving. She would kind of cook for an army on Thanksgiving. And I'm guilty of it too. I do the same thing. And I think it's just because I was around her for so many years, and just seeing her do that. We would just run out of room to put food, so she would get out an old ironing board and put a tablecloth over it and lay food on it, just to have a place to put everything. She always went way overboard, and she was a fabulous cook too. So Christmas was always special. She did what she could. We didn't have much. There was one Christmas though, I remember she actually went and took out a loan just to buy us Christmas, because she wanted to make it extra special. But I remember when I was little, my sister and I would sleep underneath the Christmas tree, We knew it was there, but we still get up early and still go through everything. So, she tried to, make holidays as special as she could. We'd hide Easter eggs at Easter, and, she tried to make it special.
You mentioned that she was an excellent cook. Did you have a favorite dish that she prepared?
That's hard because I don't think she really made anything that was bad ever. There's a few things that she made that was different, I guess, for me, and that I particularly liked. Like, she would make stuffed bell peppers, and she would make, of course, the good old Southern, chicken and dumplings, and, stuff like that, But, like I said, there was never anything that she made that I disliked. And like I said, pretty much all of my recipes came from watching her. So I liked them well enough that I still use them with my own family. So I'd say, pretty much everything she made was great.
You know how to make homemade biscuits?
I can make homemade biscuits, but I cannot make the white gravy to save my life. That's the one thing that she did beautifully that I still cannot do, and I've tried, and I will burn it every time. But she made the best white gravy.
Thank you for providing and allowing me to share some of your family pictures. I especially like this picture of this guy and what looks like he's having a dental procedure.
Yeah, it's the picture of the Hoover family, and they are kind of sitting prim and proper, over to the side, and then he's in the chair, and somebody decided that was the day they used to pull his tooth, and everybody else was just kind of relaxing while he was having his little procedure done outside. It must have been a beautiful day, and they figured why not. So, but it's a hilarious picture. It's one of my favorites for sure.
So the majority of your family was a Appalachian family.
Absolutely. Just about all of them, actually, from both sides. So.
Did you find an ancestor that once fed a president?
It's all speculation. Supposedly there was a woman that lived in Tennessee. I think her main name was Mary Faust. And I'm still trying to get the connection. I was told that she's like a distant cousin, and somehow, which is very possible because that's where all of my Faust family pretty much lived and resided, was in Tennessee. But supposedly she fed, I believe it was Teddy Roosevelt. She was, at that time, she was considered one of the oldest people in America. And so he came and visited her and dined on a dinner of, I believe it was possum. But she was
a delicacy.
A Appalachian delicacy. So yes, she sounds like a very interesting woman. I've just recently found out about her, so she's somebody I'm still digging on. If I can find that direct line, she's definitely an interesting person, for sure. She lived with her 2 children. I believe they lived with her, I guess probably at least up until she passed. They may have always lived with her, even through their adult years. They all lived on the mountain together, and she stayed at her loom, and they helped her, and she was just a very eccentric woman, I think.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you for taking the time to stroll down memory lane with me.
Thank you for having me, and I was happy to do it.